Pokemon types have always been a very interesting concept to me. They are very essential building blocks when it comes to a Pokemon's appearance, personality, or how they're used in battle. I'm pretty sure a lot of you out there have a favorite type of Pokemon for many different reasons, and hey, I do too. Pokemon Red and Blue started with a total of 15 Pokemon types to choose from, but occasionally Game Freak will bless us with a brand new type that shakes things up a lot. And by that, I mean like every 10 years or something. It's been a really long time. You would think they would try this again after seeing how successful the last new type was, considering that so many people loved fairy type Pokemon. But after thinking about how long it's been, we aren't just asking when a new Pokemon type is coming anymore. It's coming down to if we're even getting one at all. And we're talking about ones that aren't exclusive to a gimmick that we'll probably never see again. Honestly, I have a ton of ideas as to why they haven't so far, and I wanted to run you guys through my thoughts on all of this. And I think the best way to start is by talking about the times that we actually did get new types, because this is very important. The 3 new types that were added, as you may know, were Dark and Steel in Generation 2 and the Fairy type in X and Y. Even to this day, all 3 of them are very powerful types. But if you weren't around at those times, well, those types weren't just given to us for fun. Now, if I get anything wrong here, I do apologize. I can't speak with full confidence for Generations 1 and 2 since I wasn't even alive at that time, but my dedicated research over at google.com has taught me many things, including the reason why these types were even added to begin with, and it was for the sole purpose of game balance. Now, if you compare Dark, Steel, and Fairy, you'd notice that all 3 of these types have an immunity of some sort. Now, Steel being immune to poison wasn't a big deal at the time, at least I don't think it was. But Dark and Fairy being immune to Psychic and Dragon was very huge for their respective generations. During the era of Generation 1, Psychic was a ridiculously good type, with only 1 resistance to itself, only 2 weaknesses in Bug and Ghost, and really powerful Pokemon like Alakazam and Mewtwo. It had a massive chokehold in the days of Red and Blue. Like I said, it did have 2 weaknesses, but there was a problem with that. Most Bug-type Pokemon back then were pretty much a joke, and Gengar was the only Ghost-type Pokemon available in Gen 1. Gengar was not the dominant force that it was today, or how it was before it lost Levitate. It suffered really badly due to the lack of a physical special split. Gengar, as we all know, is a special attacker, but for some reason, Game Freak made Ghost a physical type in Generation 1, and they also ended up making it a poison type as well, so they completely botched it by making it weak to Psychic too. And I didn't even bring up the craziest thing yet, because it turns out that none of this matters anyways. As we all know, Gen 1 came with a lot of bugs, but it turns out that one of them made Psychic type Pokemon immune to Ghost type moves, even though absolutely everywhere else you look told us otherwise. So yeah, Psychic was very broken. Luckily, they fixed that issue in Gen 2 while also taking a bit of extra measures, which, if you couldn't tell by now, was to make more types that could resist Psychic, including one that's completely immune to it. And that's how Dark and Steel types were introduced to us in Gen 2. Steel was also made to be a really powerful defensive type that not only just resisted Psychic, but many others as well. If you think resisting 10 types was insane, which it very much is, back then it resisted 12, but they decided to get rid of Ghost and Dark in Gen 6 and replace it with Fairy. And we didn't even fully get into Dark type Pokemon yet. They were meant to be the end all be all for Psychic type Pokemon. Having full immunity to Psychic moves essentially just made them a hard counter, making strong Pokemon like Alakazam and Mewtwo unable to just roam around freely. And funnily enough, Fairy had a very similar origin story, but this time with Dragon type Pokemon. Dragon type Pokemon weren't that much of a threat in the earlier gens due to the severe lack of their existence. But with each generation came more and more big beefy boys with insane stats that needed to be addressed, which Game Freak did with Fairy in the exact same way as they did over 10 years prior. And now, why did I just bore you with this history lesson? Well, for one, it's because I thought it was pretty cool. And 2, it's because we need to ask ourselves here, are we currently in a similar situation where one type is too dominant over the other types? And the answer, in my opinion, is I don't think so. It's very weird to think about, especially considering competitive formats like Pokemon VGC, where the metagame and format shifts a lot. I remember the early days of Scarlet and Violet, where size spam was really good, and then we saw teams with 2 or even 3 dark types on them. And in Regulation H, there was a point where steel types were very strong, but it's hard to tell if a certain type is too strong because everything constantly changes. And this doesn't even include the other changing factors like the gimmicks or the fact that only a select handful of Pokemon are in the game thanks to Dexit, which if you don't know is the term for the national dex no longer being a thing. We literally cannot catch them all anymore. But anyways, I feel like if there was a prominently strong type throughout all of this, it would be very clear by now. But until that's the case, our chance of getting a new type is pretty low because there's nothing we'd really need to balance right now. Now this doesn't mean it would be impossible, as I'd still love to see a type that isn't just meant to hard counter something specific. Maybe we could get a new type that could just check some of the notable types, similar to what Steel did. And this also doesn't mean that we'll never run into this situation again. Maybe they'll keep adding more broken Steel types, like with this unholy trinity of Gen 9. It's Pokemon, so at the end of the day, anything can happen. Now, I also do want to talk about the popular choices that I've been seeing around when it comes to new Pokemon types. The two biggest ones in my opinion are Light and Sound, and I honestly do think that both are very reasonable. It would be pretty cool to have Light be a polar opposite of Dark in a way that represents purity, and at this point I feel like we are way overdue for Sound. It just makes a ton of sense on a lot of Pokemon, but we also have to think about implementing those types in the first place. The first thing would be ensuring that they aren't too strong like how Fairy was when it first dropped. But once we get past that, it would be not just adding new moves and Pokemon, but also modifying already existing Pokemon that are much deserving of those types. I took it upon myself to look back at what they did for previous types, and I noticed something a little interesting. Obviously, when Fairy and Steel dropped, they added those types to Pokemon that only had one type to begin with. And they also swapped the types of certain Pokemon to be Fairy type as well. But for everything that they did this for, there was one thing that literally every single one of them had in common. And it was that they only did this for normal type Pokemon. And it wasn't just like this for Pokemon, but for all the normal type moves as well. They did not touch a single other move, and no other Pokemon lost one of their types in favor of Fairy except for normal type Pokemon. That was all very confusing to say, but I hope it makes sense to you guys. Now, I'm not entirely sure, but one of the possible reasons that would make the most sense to me is because of how little of an impact the normal type has compared to all the other Pokemon types. Normal Pokemon are meant to be average Joes. There's nothing really special about them, and the type is almost like a lack of identity in that sense. So giving them a different type is almost like an upgrade to who they are, and that's probably why they didn't touch other Pokemon. Now, when you think about a light type, you think about Pokemon such as Lantern and Solgaleo, which are Pokemon with two types already. And this might sound really stupid, but I'm not sure how much Game Freak wants to touch these Pokemon. Although they make sense as light, whatever type they lose takes away from what that type has to bring to the table. And the same can probably be said about the moves as well. But now, in defense of Sound, this type might actually make a lot more sense, as a lot of sound-based Pokemon and moves are the normal type. Sure, we would have to figure out a few things, like certain Pokemon and the gut-wrenching nerf losing Pixelate Hyper Voice would do to Sylveon, but I feel like Sound doesn't have this problem anywhere near as bad as Light would. And if anything, I really don't see a reason why they haven't added Sound yet besides one, and it's because just like with a lot of things, they simply don't need to. With 18 types already in the game, we already have an extremely diverse lineup of types, and this just hasn't been anything that the community has been really vocal about wanting either. So at that point, why even bother doing it? Well, this is finally the part of the video where I get to share my opinion on all of this, and it's that if they ever do it, I think adding a new type would be fantastic for this game. Now, I know how poor the release of Dark and Steel type Pokemon were in Gen 2, with very few choices for each, and the Steel type gym leader having the most boring team I could ever imagine. I'm not sure how much those two types meant to people back then, but with more Pokemon and moves to look into this time around, how they went about implementing the Fairy type Pokemon in X and Y was just fantastic. They managed to find a way to introduce an answer to Dragon type Pokemon while also bringing so much life into previous Pokemon that would usually be overlooked. And hey, let's not forget the fact that it came with a brand new evolution as well, which was also something that they did in Gen 2 with Umbreon. Sure, Fairy types did feel a bit strong back then, but it was still one of the more loved things to come out of X and Y, which for the most part, a lot of people hated those games. If you're being completely honest here, if my theory about just not changing Pokemon outside of the normal type turns out to be true, then I'm not a big fan of that. I love Pokemon so much, but if there's one thing I'd always love to see more of, well, it's change. And a change of type could help these poor forgotten Pokemon who are just looking for something to make them better. As for the other types, you could always just make more moves for them as well if you want to go that route. But the more I talk about this, the more I kinda get it actually. All of this just sounds like way too much work and balancing for something people aren't demanding as much. Think about it, compared to X and Y, we now have way more Pokemon and moves to look at. So the balancing and the adjusting to implement this new type would take so much effort, especially when that time and effort could be put into something that is almost universally wanted, such as better graphics and less bugs than what we've we've been getting lately. Hey, maybe Stellar was their way of trying to implement a new type without having to look at all of this. But at least with them now taking more time between games, it could still very much be possible. Unless whatever is happening with Legends EA is a one-type thing, which I really hope it isn't. Either way, regardless of what happens, I can't really be mad at Game Freak for not thinking it's worth the effort, especially considering there are a lot of other things to be upset at TPCI for. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed me rambling about Pokemon types for so long. I can't really tell what led to me wanting to make this video. The idea kind of just sprung to my head randomly at 3 AM, and I've been wanting to try different things, so I just decided I would give it a shot. But I kind of had fun with this. Be sure to leave a comment below and let me know what are your thoughts on all of this. And if you had to choose a new type to be added, what would it be? Thank you so much for watching as always, and I hope you have a fantastic day. I'll see you in the next one, whenever that is.